Do you want to stand here?
I can come here for a
camera angle.
Is this the good camera angle? Okay,
No,
I'm coming here.
This was camera angle.
Good camera angle. All right. It's 12 sharp. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Also, on my behalf, this is my first time holding the box. My name is Matilda Stoll. I'm a postdoc here at Tampere University. Today, we have a very special guest speaker, Azul Romo Flores. She can introduce herself, I think, in more detail in a little while. But I just wanted to say that we met back in 2022. And this was a very tiny little workshop at SIGS that Osva Freeman and I and colleagues from University of Jyväskylä organized. I think we were maybe 8 people apart from the organizers, but it was an excellent workshop in that sense that everybody actually decided to stay in touch, and here we are today. So the name of the game here is that Azul will be talking for roughly 40 minutes, and then we have time for some questions afterwards from here in the room and also online, where my colleagues will help facilitate those. But without further ado, welcome Azul.
Thank you so much for the background to how we met, and thank you so much for having me here. I am very thrilled to be able to present during this Oasis Talks. The title of this presentation is called Learning to Esports, which is also coincidentally the title of my thesis project, because I am a PhD student. And before I kind of go through what I'm going to talk about, I thought I'd just briefly introduce myself. I have a bachelor's degree in making games, but then it wasn't really my thing, so I moved over to a different discipline where I instead study or analyze existing games. So this in Södertörn University is called Media and Communication Studies, and it's aligned under the arts and humanities or social sciences track. I have also worked as a lecturer in media technologies for a few years until I got into this current PhD position, also in media and communication studies. And just kind of as a context, rather than being part of a project, I applied with my own research project, but it kind of needs to align to the theme of the doctoral research school, which is titled School, Sport, Screen. And it is, the aim is to kind of generate new knowledge that can contribute to teachers' education in Sweden. And it's a collaboration between the Department of Sociology of Education in Uppsala University and Sports Sciences University, also in Sweden, and my department, of course. So without further ado, this talk I have split it up in kind of 3 parts. First, I will talk about esports in culture and society and kind of give this historical overlook of how it has come to be to how it is today. And then with that background, I thought I would step in and present my research project and how it fits into that research area. And also, I'm not really I am far along, but I still have a lot of things to do. But I also didn't want to leave you empty-handed, so I will also present some kind of findings from one of the first studies that I did as part of the project. I have gotten 40 minutes. I will try to stick to that, but please tell me if I have shorter time left. Yes, so when it comes to esports as we know it today, it's quite a recent or not so old concept. It has been around for maybe 20 to 30 years. But if we look at the practices of competitive digital gaming, these have existed for far more longer. Some date back to the 1970s. But there are 3 aspects which I think are even more crucial to discuss to kind of see a longer historical perspective of how these phenomenon has come to be as it is today. And the first one is the aspect of competition. Kalle Jonasson, which is also a Swedish sports scientist, he has argued that, for example, when you compare certain aspects of esports today, you can also trace them back to other more ancient forms like the Roman games. And that is through the aspect of competition. Now, he used the Roman games, but because I have Mexican heritage, I thought it would be more interesting to maybe show this. It's called the ball game from prehistoric Mexico that Aztecs used to play. That also is a form of competition and games. The second aspect is connected to the theme of war and war gaming. And here, excuse me if I pronounce it incorrectly, but Boluk and Lemieux, they discuss how Early forms of like simulations and tabletop strategy games later influenced games like Warhammer 4K, which later also influenced the like digital transition to games like Warcraft, which then also became the origin story of modern esports titles like Defense of the Ancients. I will come back to this shortly, but to kind of give a historical view of this. And the third aspect is technology itself. Now, I chose the computers because that's kind of when I entered this sphere, but you can also trace it further back to other earlier iterations of home consoles, but also arcade machines, for example. And naturally, what is possible to create for digital games is through the development of the technologies, but more importantly also what is possible to do beyond the game, for example, in terms of spectatorship and like how technology facilitates these additional media-related practices. So if we move forward in time to what esports are today, there are a lot of different definitions ranging back from around 20 years ago. But something that they negotiate is then whether it's a physical or like an intellectual or mental ability that is used in order to practice the so-called mediated sport, because there's certain differences. And it also the definitions also emphasize, for example, that it's a mediated sport that's enabled through networked games or interfaces, for example. But something that all the definitions have in common is the focus on that it's about organized play. So it's not just spontaneous fun play, but it's actually, you have tournaments, you set up leagues, there's kind of like a ranking system and so on. And the definition that I think fits well with my thesis is then Jin's definition. It's actually originated from 2010, but yeah, wrong reference there. And one more aspect that I think is really important to highlight when it comes to talking about esports is that they're not really a genre, but when we look at how they originated, it was through the community that had access to technologies that developed mods to existing competitive digital games and then created their own versions of how to play these games. And then later on, they became adopted by larger companies to be like their own franchises. So some of you might be familiar with Defense of the Ancients, which was a mod for Warcraft 3. Overwatch, which is kind of very popular today, was influenced by Team Fortress, which was also a mod for Quake. And Counter-Strike initially was also a mod for Half-Life, for example. So there's this, I think these cases really illustrate this kind of aspects of social play that go beyond what you actually do with the game to all this, it has like, we put an emphasis on the historical and like technological and social aspects that go beyond what we do with the games themselves. And that is something that I think is very central to, there's a lot of discourses whether sports are or are not sports. And I think if we take it up to this kind of meta level that includes what has been done with esports, I think it's a better level to discuss like how media can be seen as a sport by itself, which is kind of like the theoretical underpinning to like the discipline that I come from and how I study esports. And this growth of esports has led to its own industry in a way. Naturally, the professionalization of gaming itself counts as a new career, but also we see a migration from existing careers coming into the esports to kind of like strengthen the field. So traditional journalism will also create its own venue or like subcategory within esports and so on. And this has kind of raised, a need for maybe having some kind of esports education. And luckily, we have so much interesting research about how we can use games for learning, how we can use gamification approaches to make things interesting and motivate students to learn. There's also a lot of research that looks at game-based learning for how we can use games as kind of like a context for learning about a different subject or skills and so on. There's also a major research area focusing on serious games. But what all of these studies lack is exactly like how esports fits into existing research, because naturally the content of esports game is related to competition and war and topics that normally are not introduced in scholarly settings, or that don't follow these kind of like civic values that many people would prefer having in schools. Which kind of leads me to wonder, okay, but then where is this education needed? Is it in the formal setting? Is it in informal settings through associations? What kind of education is being taught? Because there is some research that has looked at how esports has already entered higher education programs, for example. So, but more importantly, also pose critical questions about like, okay, but looking beyond that, what is being taught, what should be taught in this context and through this practice. And that being said, that is kind of where my research project comes in, titled Learning to Esports. And the aim is to investigate and describe the institutionalization of esports movement through its integration in education. And the focus is in Sweden. I will explain why soon. But the main research questions that I have been trying to answer are, first and foremost, why this kind of esports education should be included in Swedish upper secondary schools as educational profiles, and also what characterizes this pedagogy and the organization of esports profiles in said schools. And lastly, also to kind of understand if there is some kind of educational value in terms of knowledge and attitudes and skills that one is expected to learn, but also how this educational value is then transmitted to the students or pupils, because they're actually younger. So I could talk about Swedish education for hours, but kind of to condense why this case is interesting to study, first and foremost, is because similar to many other Nordic and European countries, there is a social welfare model where education is one of the pillars. That means that tax money funds education so that it's free and a right for all the young people of that country. However, due to some neoliberal reforms that have been ongoing since the 1970s in Sweden, one major change to the system was that schools became privatized. So in order for this to work, so that companies can earn a profit from taxpayer money, there is first the free choice model, which means that students are not locked to the nearest school within their municipality. They're actually free to choose whichever school they want throughout the whole country. And then there is a voucher system. So there's a little flyer that represents some economic amount that is then given by the home municipality where the student lives, so to speak, to the school that then accepts the student where they will be enrolled. So this means that this educational space, which should provide equal education for everyone and lesser this kind of like stratification of people, is not actually working, because there are schools that then promote their study programs to certain profiles. They can market that they have better quality education when they actually can't, because municipal or public schools, they're not meant to have that kind of focus on marketing and say that they give better education, because for them it's natural that they need to provide education whether they want to or not, because it's a basic right. And when we talk about privatization, there are two categories. So it's like the public, focused on state management, which is normally through the municipalities themselves, but it can also in some cases be by the region or the state. And then on the private side, there are mostly commercial entities, but there are also non-profit foundations. I will come back to this a little bit later, but just to give you an understanding of why Sweden is quite an interesting case, because this is one of the few countries in the world that has this system in upper secondary education level. So yeah, if you remember my research questions, in order to answer them, I am again from media and communication studies. So I use the framework of mediatization theory, which basically it looks like that the historical process of how changes in media also affect changes in other institutions of life. Particularly, I use Christian Franzén's approach to look at the mediatization of sports and therefore also understand how esports affects people. But because I'm looking at education, I'm also interested in frameworks that help me understand what kind of skills and abilities are related to school and formal schooling and knowledge. So then I use digital media literacy to support those thoughts. I am also engaging with a lot of sociology of education. Naturally, Bourdieu is a choice, and specifically field theory. I will come back to this later, but also Basil Bernstein's ideas of how knowledge is understood in society and then transmitted and like reworked so that it fits the school form of a curriculum. And then the third pinnacle or like the third spot to create my theoretical triangle is the sociology of sports. This kind of hints a little bit already at the results, but in Sweden, esports are not a subject per se, but they're normally placed under the physical education and health subject. So for this reason, I have turned to Håkan Larsson and tried to get a better understanding of how the concept of Nordic sports, which are called idrott, which is a little bit different from like common understandings of sports, are used, but also how this works as a subject in school, how it has come to be as it is, how you can teach such a subject, and kind of like the theories of learning that are used to deliver this kind of education. But more importantly, I also use Karin Redelius' ideas of how sports or idrott can be used as a site to foster good citizen and encourage pupils to engage in like civic participation, which is something that normally is lacking when we look at how what kind of skills and abilities that are encouraged or fostered through esports. So this is the whole picture of my beautiful, messy theoretical framework. And when it comes to the research design, it is also very broad, but I think it kind of makes sense. Hopefully you can follow along. The first sub-study is a field analysis, which I also will be presenting later in this talk. And here I look at what schools are offering esports, how these are organized, how they're structured, how they include esports, and so on. And then I move to look at the curriculum, and I do an analysis to kind of identify what kind of knowledge and skills that are related to the esports activity, so to speak, or like the profiles. And then I move to look at, I use ethnographic methods, and I have done classroom observations to see what happens in a classroom where they teach esports. So what actually happens when the teachers need to read through the curriculum and say, okay, how do we fit esports into these learning objectives that are requested, and also talk with students and see what they think that they learn through esports. So is it just like related to learning how to play the game, or is there like more to it? Like, do they learn to collaborate, and is this something that is applicable elsewhere, and so on? And because these are very broad questions, I think curriculum theory really helps me to kind of find this connection between the different levels of education that ranges from the societal level and what is understood as knowledge and valuable knowledge, to then move to the curriculum and what is intended for students to learn. And then finally, what is actually being learned, or like how is that being done? And the material is also very varied. I originally wanted to do an ethnography and only look at classrooms, but I had a lot of difficulties getting access to schools and get to be there for longer periods of time. So in total, I visited 3 schools throughout like 7 different like instances. So I do have some material that was very helpful, but then in order to kind of make my data a bit more rich, I moved to, okay, let's look at the curriculum and let's analyze that. And for the field analysis, this was kind of like the first thing I did. It was like, okay, how big is this thing? Like, is it just one school that has esports, or are there many schools? So it was kind of to get an understanding of the range of esports education in Sweden, which later I then added field theory to kind of explain. Results-wise, I'm still figuring out how to get everything together, but I'm going to talk about the first sub-study then, which is field-inspired analysis. So in a nutshell, for those who are not familiar with Bourdieu's field theory, it basically describes that when you have a field, it's defined by a social space where you have different agents who compete for different forms of resources, or capital as it's called, And then you have some that have greater amount of resources, and therefore they're the dominant ones who can set certain restrictions on how to play the game, so to speak. And then you have other agents who do not have as much capital, who are struggling and need to fight their way to kind of stay on the playing field and continue to be in that playing field. And when it comes to the analysis, normally what you do is that you first start by identifying all these actors that are playing in that field. And then you connect, okay, is there like a bigger field of power that defines how this game is played? And then you move on to kind of like position them in this field. And what I did was that I collected a lot of already existing information through scraping school websites and like school databases where there's information if there is an esports program. And then I kind of like created my own database of like which these schools are, where they're located, what forms of esports they offer, the size of the school in some occasions. I also used national statistics. We have like a agency that collects statistics for different different purposes, and there I could also extract data to see like get more information about, for example, pupils and who owns the schools that I have identified and so on. And that kind of resulted in this nice table, which I notice now is missing a number. But yeah, so all in all, it was 51 unique schools across 3 years. And then these were later broken down into 33 different forms of management, which I will come back to. And as I was kind of collecting this information, I also noticed that not all the information is out there. Some schools don't really market their schools. So then I kind of started contacting the schools to kind of get to talk to staff, get to ask more questions about the programs, and get a little bit more information so I could understand like what is going on and how this esports education is arranged. And in addition to that, I mean, the esports in school don't really exist in a vacuum. They exist in relation to the esports movement in Sweden, for example, and also on a global level. So for this purpose, I contacted some esports organizations in Sweden to also get a better understanding of the field or like the movement. Yes. So when it comes to who manages these esports schools, 2/3 of the identified actors were actually private. Really interesting is that Academedia, who is a like big company, owns both individual schools and school franchises. So for example, there's a franchise called LBS Gymnasium, Ljudbildskolan, and they have like one LBS school in Stockholm, one LBS school in Malmö, and so on across different cities. But they're all basically the same format, they have the same name, and so on. And Academedia is a really big actor that owns a lot of schools ranging from primary to adult education, specifically in the Nordic countries, but also, for example, in Germany and other countries in Europe. And in Sweden alone, they actually own like 150 upper secondary schools, and that accounts for like 11% of the school market, which is insane if you ask me. But there are also some non-profit foundations that are also involved in this. So I identified 3 of them. It's also a school franchise, so it's actually, you could technically count them as one. And then we have 1/3 of the managers who represent the municipalities. And here it's a bit different because, for example, the Stockholm municipality actually manages 27 different schools. So it's quite obviously a big municipality because it's the capital and they need to manage quite a lot of schools. But then there were also like smaller municipalities that maybe only manage 2 or 3 schools. And one of those schools then had esports. You might have also noticed that when I talk about the esports education, I don't really refer to it as a program, and that is because there are no such things as esports programs as the landscape looks today. So what happens is that when a student wants to read or apply to like an esports profile, they first need to choose a like normal study program. So the national agency has done like predefined the 16 different study programs, like a natural science program, the economy program, social science program, and so on. And that based on that, you choose a school that offers that program. And then if they have esports, then you can add that to your program, and then you take certain credits in it. So the most common programs that were attached to esports were the electricity and energy program, the technology program, and then the arts program, but with a specialization in media and aesthetics. And the abbreviations I have put behind here indicate whether it's a vocational training program or a preparatory for higher education program. And that kind of is relevant because it means that you will get different amount of credits in your study plan depending on, for example, when it comes to like the core subjects, you will get more of those for the higher education ones than you would get for the vocational ones. And then, for example, out of the total of 2,500 credits that you get in your study plan, you can use 100 or 200 as individual choice to read an esports course, for example. And then there are some schools which can apply to become sports schools and then offer specialization courses in sports, which can account to up to 700 credits of the total. So they get students enrolled in national sports schools gets to read more sports credits. So for someone who really wants to become an esports athlete and take more classes in physical education, they would want to apply to one of those schools. Yes, so moving on. When it comes to like identifying the field and the actors, I have separated them into 4 categories. I accidentally put this the wrong way around. But so there's the field of power, which is naturally the state that defines what is possible to teach. So they do that through the National Agency for Education, Skolverket, by defining, for example, the programs, the courses that are available, and what kind of subjects that should be taught, aligning with those study programs. But then the state also regulates what counts as a sport, and they do that through the National Sports Agency, Riksidrottsförbundet. So for the schools that want to apply to have a sports program, they actually need to ask for permission, and then Riksidrottsförbundet needs to say, well, esports needs to count as a sport for us to be able to give you that permission. And when I started this project, it wasn't a real sport, but in 2023 it was voted in during the General Assembly. So now it's officially a sport in Sweden, which also means that schools get extra funding in order to like sustain this kind of like esports activity or a sport. And there's also like competence development training for coaches and so on. And yeah, so the agents, sorry for this messy presentation. I identified kind of like 4 different categories, and I see them kind of, I will show you a picture soon, and it's kind of like a matrix where I have 2 axes, X and Y, and it's kind of like a spectrum. So you can't be only an institutional actor, you're kind of like on a range between institutional and grassroots. And what I was thinking here is that it is the like capital volume that an agent has that defines where they're positioned in the field. And the institutional agency just means that they have higher legitimacy to make claims about, for example, the esports schools. Grassroots refers to, like, for example, associations or like community-driven initiatives or communities and so on. The other range is between, it focuses basically on the economic incentive. So is it a commercial company that's only after economic profit, or is it a non-profit foundation, for example, that just wants to do this? So for this field analysis, I also involved Esports United, which you can see are also one of the active institutional agents in the esports movement. I had a certain understanding of this field, but I kind of wanted to include them in this process to create this this mapping so that it would be a bit more accurate and representative, and also so that it can come back into the community and hopefully be used in some way. So, for example, for agents that are located in the upper right quartile that have high institutional capital and also high commercial interest, we have the game companies themselves, because they both develop and in some cases also manage the platforms and infrastructures that are used for the esports movement. So, for example, ESL is like the major organization that also manages Faceit, which is a platform where they players can register themselves and then get like rankings and participate in tournaments and so on. On the other side of the spectrum, where we have agents that have high institutional capital but not economic incentive, we have, for example, the Swedish esports federation or like association that manages all the elite forms of esports now that it's an official sport. And then Esports United comes in as a support function, so to speak, to kind of give further support to all the smaller independent associations that work with like community-driven esports incentives. And hence, these smaller associations are placed further down on the spectrum because they don't have as much institutional capital, but they're still there because they also have an influence. A lot of the students are mostly active in these associations after school, and then they can also continue practicing in school, for example. So I think that this kind of, well, this is more of a mapping of the esports movement. It also helps explain kind of the trajectories that esports players can go into and how they move between these different agents and how relevant it is for them. So for example, is the goal of being an esports athlete just for fun? You might want to stay in your associations and play with your friends and so on. But if you want to make it to the top tier professional levels, you might want to start moving towards the more regional or national leagues as well that are normally managed by other bigger companies. And then obviously I'm working with education, so I have kind of, this is a work in progress, it's not completely done yet, but the idea is to kind of, oh wait, sorry. These are not all the actors, these are just representational actors to kind of give an idea of who is where. But yeah, so here the same idea, I had to kind of map out where the schools are located in a similar field. So we have commercial actors like LBS that I mentioned earlier, or NTI Gymnasiet, which both are also owned by Academedia that I talked about earlier. And then we have Gilska, which is the non-foundational, managed by a non-profit foundation. And then we have the municipal or like public schools that are on the left side of the spectrum. While I do focus on upper secondary schools, I thought it would be kind of good to mention that there is not really an academic trajectory for a lot of these athletes when it comes to esports. There is an esports lab in Högskolan i Halmstad University, sorry. And there is one esports management course at the Jönköping University, but these are like independent actions. There's not like a program or more academic paths that are connected specifically to esports. Then it would have to be like some adjacent field like game development or game journalism and so on. And I have also importantly found two actors, Gameplan and Area Academy, which are commercial companies that develop esports specific instructional materials or curriculum that are like translating the physical education learning objectives to esports practices. And they sell these services to different kind of schools. And that is also really interesting because then it kind of lifts this kind of dynamic of what is being taught, who decides what is being taught. It also helps teachers in a way to not need to create these materials themselves, but there's a lot of problematic. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so now I have double. So one such strategy is then to develop niche study profiles, and I'm wondering if it, like, in one way it could help explain these kind of esports profiles and why they enter the upper secondary school market. But on the other hand, it's so is that niche enough? Like, where do you count? Like, where does the margin go? And it's also quite unclear if this actually is like an effective method for recruiting students and to what extent that is. And secondly, which I think is also sorry, more important is then the positioning of these schools. So again, the esports is often tied to the study program, and the study programs that are more common for to offer esports are normally heavily dominated by working class boys, because it's normally schools that have IT specialization that target these audiences through different strategies. And then the second point is then this kind of division between academic and vocational study programs, because it has been theorized specifically by Basil Bernstein, which will be used later, that because you read different amount of credits of like abstract knowledge, so to speak. For example, in the natural sciences and in the social sciences programs, you have access to more abstract knowledge that helps promote and develop critical thinking skills so that you can like think outside the system and like criticize the status quo. But in the vocational training programs, you don't have as much of that knowledge. Instead, you are taught to kind of follow what is already said and follow the system. You don't learn to have like critical thinking skills. And this can further affect the working class boys because they have a different kind of access to knowledge. And this is something that will affect how they view everything around them and like their worldview. So kind of to wrap up here, it has been a lot, but thank you for following along. I have to kind of wrap up the second and third study that looks at the curriculum and then the classroom observations. For those who are interested, I'm writing a monograph, so I haven't really published anything yet. I'm kind of drafting the book, and I have more or less a year left to finish this up. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I'm done.
I think we all need to share the same mic, so let's see how that works. All right, do we have any questions? I'm sure there's plenty. Right. Please talk in the mic.
Okay. Is there any esports organization that is running by the Olympic Committee? I mean, there should be a sports governing body in Sweden, right? Are there any one publicly organized by the Olympic Committee or any official sports governing body?
Thank you. It's going to be a lot of running. So as I was showing in the very beautiful slide here, the Swedish top right, Swedish Esports Association, they manage all the kind of like elite-centered forms of esports play, and they also have connections to like the European Esports Association and so on. But they're kind of like an organizing function, so to speak. The smaller associations don't normally, at least that I have found, don't normally have those connections to like broader, international association, so to speak.
But is the SESF managed by the Olympic Committee of Sweden?
No, but they are managed by Riksidrottsförbundet, who does it's yet another level that manages all the sports or official sports in Sweden. Yeah. Yes. Next.
You can throw it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Azul, for your very interesting talk and for the way you explained your work. I have two questions, but they're quick to answer, I think. I'm curious about the kind of games that are being played in these programs and how are they advertised by schools? I mean, like, do they use like specific images from specific games? And if they do, which images are they? So yeah, and then how do they grade the performance of students that participate in these programs? Is this grading based on skills, on performance, or? Okay, so schools do
often clearly state which esports titles they specialize in, because what influences that decision is whether the coach or the teacher has a competence in that game, and also how many people apply to that game. So if you're going to have a League of Legends team, you need to have 5 players or maybe some extra. And in some cases, people apply for example, Rocket League, but there's only one person, and then they don't have a team, so they cannot compete or like practice it in that elite sense. So then schools normally choose maybe 1 or 2 titles that they can specialize in, and Counter-Strike is like the most common one. Rocket League and Valorant are like on the second level, and then Dota, sometimes I've seen Valorant, but it's, yeah, quite few schools that have that. The second question was how they are graded. They're not graded in esports because it's not a subject, but the assignments that I have been looking at that the students get to do are sometimes connected with, for example, analyzing and reviewing your own play, and then having like this kind of like reflective assignment where they explain what they have learned, how they create like a training schedule, and that can be connected to the curriculum of like a physical education and health subject, and then they're graded based on that. Yes. Next questions.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. This was really interesting. Do you, I don't know if you have gotten that far or if it's something that you are interested in, but like in the academic education and vocational education, does the esports education or studies somehow different? Are they different in both of those, or are they similar and just the other education part around it is different? How do you feel?
The most common form of organizing esports was based on the physical education and health subject, but I did find that, for example, some schools, they added esports under like the media production courses. So then instead of like, some would have like, okay, you can play and train, but the focus of the course is to produce something related to the media events of esports. So you could do like graphic design and logos or so, or you could like focus on broadcasting or so. But most of them had this kind of like elite like focus on elite play, so to speak. Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it, and so this might be a question that you covered already, and I'm sorry if that's the case. But could you describe a kind of gender breakdown of the students that are in these kind of programs, and also of the teachers?
Yes. I kind of cannot. I have not explained that, but for example, what I did, because I didn't have, when I was gathering the data, I didn't initially focus on this kind of like class aspect, but later when I was doing like the scraping of which schools that offer esports and what kind of study programs that they offer at these schools, then I used like pre-gathered, or like there's a governmental agency that focuses on gathering public data, and then they like collate those that info or those statistics rather, and there I could kind of like compare that. Okay, so for all the IT related tracks, there would be normally a higher range of male students than compared to female students, for example. And similarly, I tried to look at the statistics that covered like the different municipalities where these schools were located, and tried to kind of get an understanding if I could calculate their kind of socioeconomic status, but that I really couldn't. When it comes to the teachers, that is kind of like self-reported data. So every time I have talked to a teacher or a coach, then they have also given me a little bit of demographics. But there I haven't really made like any significant details, because it has been quite a few teachers that I've spoken with. I've spoken to like 7 of them, and some of them come from public schools, some of them have like a pedagogic background, whereas others might be just coaches because they have like a career in or had a career in esports, but then chose to start training and so on. If that kind of answers your question.
I have a follow-up question, actually. Thank you so much. One thing I've been thinking about or noticing when I've been visiting similar institutions, although not in Sweden, is that teachers tend to present it that esports programs do not only give a degree, but it can also be a way to get back into school at all for those who have kind of fallen out of the school systems, and games might be the only thing that engage them in any way. So they are kind of catching those students who are maybe struggling otherwise. Is that something that you have noticed as well?
No. I have noticed that, yeah, it's on this slide. So, for example, these types of companies that promote having esports in schools, they are the ones who raise this discourse that, oh, I forgot to mention, upper secondary school is voluntary. So a lot of students actually drop out and stop studying after secondary level. So then including, for example, games and gaming has been argued to be like a way to get them to actually want to study or like come to school if they're having issues with coming to school for a variety of reasons. And it's normally these kind of companies that push this narrative that, oh, but there is a group of people or young people that don't want to come to school, so then esports is a way to attract these students. But when you look at, for example, the reports that the National Education Agency does about this group of young people, they have like addressed that it's not a matter of what subjects that are offered, it's rather like what competence does the teacher have to support, like emotionally support the students, or like how safe is the environment at school. So there are other factors that actually influence if people want to come to school. And similarly, what was I talking about? Yeah, okay, but yeah, so there are other incentives that affect whether they want to come to school or not. Yes. No.
I have many questions, but does anyone else want to? Richard, go ahead. I am not throwing anything because I don't want to risk anyone. Cheers.
Thanks, Azul. Thanks for your talk. Just wondering, sort of, to go on about the Bourdieusian sort of field framework that you gave us, that, you know, that there's different actors competing for different things. And you said you're writing a monograph and there's more studies to be done. So here you give us a sort of representation, right, of like programs that are out there for folks. And then later, I suppose, you'll be taught to teachers. Where do you see yourself in this overarching project? You know, because yes, as much as there are programs and there are educators, we ourselves as researchers are also educating people about what esports means, especially in the context of Sweden, right? Where do you find yourself within the grand scheme of your research agenda? Yeah, I'm going to pass it over to you.
I have been a little bit involved in the teachers education program at my university, and I have been specifically teaching media and information literacy, which is kind of connected to this project, and hence that's why I was in that. My theoretical framework is very messy, but I think it kind of like, I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of it, because one of the arguments I make is to kind of like understand esports in this interdisciplinary perspective. And for me, as a researcher, that kind of has been really difficult to navigate. I feel like there has been a lot of puzzle pieces that kind of fit, but they also don't fit. And I never know how much I have learned or how much I need to read in order to get to it. Like, will it work out in the end or will it not? And again, like, my research school aims to generate knowledge about that can help teachers' education. So in a way, I think that this might not help every teacher to kind of use gaming to attract all students, because obviously not everybody likes games, which is weird, but yeah, not everybody likes games. But I think that there can be some kind of contribution to kind of a little bit what Matilda was addressing with, like, okay, but there is a group of students to whom this actually is meaningful. So then how can we use that to continue helping that group of students, for example? And again, I don't think like maybe esports is the solution, but it's just one case study to also advance kind of the knowledge about media, or in this case, digital media literacy, about what should be taught. Like, is it only processing information, or maybe like how to be critical about engaging in online spaces or attitudes towards how we do things? And that is something that I feel is very relevant for me as a researcher as well. So in some cases, I don't really relate to my students. I'm not a teenager anymore. But in other cases, I try to focus on this like teacher perspective, because as an academic, yeah, I am researching, but I'm also teaching. So I feel like there are some connections, or like overlaps at least. Yeah.
How deeply are professional esports teams involved in those educational programs? I mean, NIP, Alliance, Johnny Speed.
That I know, not a lot. There is an interesting case where the founder of Area Academy is also the national sports team manager for a lot of the current esport branches, so to speak, and he has been really involved in kind of trying to merge the educational aspect with the associations and elite or professional forms of play, but I'm not sure how involved he is with the specific teams. And I think right now, at least in the Swedish movement, it's normally through the associations and that students actually make their way towards being recruited by teams and so on. That I have found it's less about the school and more about where they are playing after school, so to speak. But it's also, I mean, this is quite recent, and again, there are not so many schools that focus on esports education or esports profiles, and I think that's why it has been a bit overlooked by teams, because there is already kind of a career trajectory that you're playing outside of school, and for example, you're a really good player, and then request to enter the official channels in some way, or you do it through competing with your team, through your association, for example. So there are already other ways of entering these professional spaces that are not necessarily available through the schools. But that's why in this kind of space with the schools, it's also important for them to establish these connections to make their schools relevant, so that they want to produce esports athletes that are successful, so that they can get more students to come and study at their schools. So for them, it's actually vital to have these connections to other actors in the movement. But how good they have sent the students to professional teams, that I have not really looked into, or I don't really have data to support that.
Any other questions? Well, I can take one here in between. Where do I start? Something I noticed, so for those who don't know that, I have been looking at a Finnish school with an esports profile and in-game data of that. And one of the things we noticed there was that there was this learning happening through this novice-master relationship, that the more established, and this is very common in general in online games, that is how we tend to learn games. We play with someone who knows a bit more about them, and they show us the ropes, which can show, in this case, it showed that, hey, they learned how to do call-outs correctly according to this team. But then on the other hand, that also means that misogyny, racism, and those kind of things can also be encouraged by this master person in this case. So is this something that you have seen in this material? I understand that this is organized teaching, but is there any kind of resonance there?
Yes, that is a common topic that teachers normally address. I have seen, I mean, it really depends on the teacher's position and their attitudes towards it as well. Because, for example, I noticed that some students, they might be just yelling across the room and saying, expressing themselves when they lose, for example, in very explicit ways. And then the teacher might be busy doing something with another student, and then they don't catch up on that, for example. But in other cases, they have had lectures where, I mean, a teacher told me this, I wasn't present at one, but that they have had it as a topic to discuss during a lesson. So okay, now today we're going to talk about misogyny in games. Have you experienced it? Okay, how have you dealt with that? And so on. So then they create kind of a pedagogic situation from these kind of topics. But then again, it really depends on what attitudes the teacher has towards it as well. Yeah.
This is connected to your question, actually. I mean, you did mention that most of the schools who offer programs offering esports are schools that are focusing on IT programs that are normally found in areas or in areas that attract working class boys. I think you mentioned. Is the gender divide, the gender gap, the gender, call it the way you you prefer the gender, I don't know, stereotypical view of connected to a sports month. Is it kept in these programs, not only by schools, but also by the kind of coaches they have? Are they all men? Do we have some coaches who are women? What are the general attitudes and expectations by students? Are girl students frequent? And are they accepted by their peers? Yeah.
Yeah, so naturally it's going to be mostly men, but in some schools there were, for example, those aligned that had like the media production aspect of esports, there would be more women enrolled in these programs. And this is something that we also see, for example, in the games development program where I used to attend, but also where I used to teach, that normally within like arts we have a higher number of women attending these programs. And I think the same can be seen in the esports program. Something that I found really interesting was that for some women that had like enrolled into esports was because they didn't have access to these games or technologies at home. So then attending school was a way to, oh, so this is the game that all my friends were talking about, and now I get to play it and I get to see what it's all about. And that was something that I thought was really cool, because then you could see that it wasn't really the focus on like, oh, I want to be an elite player, but it was more of kind of this aspect of being included in the friendship group or like the social groups as well. Especially for the few girls that I did talk to about why they were like enrolled in those programs and so on. And then there was, I didn't include it in this material because it wasn't an esports course, it was just like a gaming kind of course. But there, for example, there were more women that were enrolled, and they also talked about like how games can be meaningful, and it doesn't necessarily have to be esports. Like if that was a title for the course, then that's what it is, but it was more like the general gaming interest. And when it comes to the teachers, it was again mostly males, and specifically when it comes to like the coaching teachers, they were often always men. I did have one when it comes to like physical education and health teachers, there would also be like more balanced, because there's a lot of women who teach this subject in Sweden, but they might not have the competence to teach in esports, so then the schools would hire like a coach, normally a male coach, and that's kind of the balance that would be, because for the esports profiles that have the physical education and health subject, they also take normal classes in sports or like physical education, so like dietary needs, sleeping habits, and so on. And then female teachers could also teach that because it's part of the same curriculum. Yeah.
Would you mind mentioning that interesting example about marketing, the gamer one?
Which one?
The gamer one.
Yeah. So, for example, in it was part of the game plan curriculum, which again was is a company that develops esports educational material. One thing that I noticed was that they tried to be a little bit more like gender inclusive in their appearance and aesthetics in the material, because it's like only online resources. So then there was this like images of maybe people of color playing games, or like women in front of the computers and so on. And then there was like the instructional text of like what the assignment for that esports lesson was going to be about. But then the linguistics that were used were like, okay, so today we're going to talk about I don't know, esports psychology, and psychology is this and that. So let's get started, gamers. And it was like naturally very directed towards a male audience. And this, in my view, was supposed to be also targeted like whoever is taking these courses, which also includes females. But then, as we know, for example, from Usva's study, that not all gamers want to be related to this terminology or like this concept. So then it creates a bit of tension. I have not studied how this is interpreted by students, but it's like my own interpretation. But yeah, I think it's a good example of how this is also present in like the materials, not only the attitudes of teachers and students.
We have a super short question.
Final question. How deeply are common esports sponsors involved with those educational programs? I'm asking about Red Bull's X35, Max Gaming, and Teddy, like that.
Somewhat, not so much in the schools per se, but for example, if the school has a team and they participate in a tournament that is sponsored by, say, Chips brand, then if they win the contest, they will get like a whole big pile of chips from that brand. But so they're not, as far as I'm concerned, or what I have observed, the brands don't sponsor the schools individually, but like it's normally like surrounding the esport participation in tournaments where they actually do sponsor.
Do they get involved in the education?
I don't know. That remains to be seen, actually. Maybe they will in the future, because there is a economic profit to be gained. But at least the schools that I have looked at have not had the like brands in their marketing for the profiles. Yes.
Quickly check with Kati if we have any online questions. No. Okay, then I have one final question for you, and that is, since we are a group of game studies scholars, what is the one main takeaway you wish we would have from your presentation today from a game studies? Was that too difficult one?
It is a tough question, but I like that question. I think for me, it has been really difficult to navigate, like, okay, what is game studies and how do I, as a, like, I'm not in game studies, so how can I contribute to that and take away it? But I think game studies is also so broad that this kind of fit into that. Sorry for holding the mic far away. So I think that's kind of like the key takeaway, to looking at different angles to kind of continue pursuing more knowledge about games. I mean, my interest is moving beyond the games themselves, but there are other ways, of course. So I think that's like one of the takeaways.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are heading for lunch.